So I'm Jack Wenzinger. I am a partner solutions architect. I work for Amazon Web Services. Essentially, the role is dedicated to, at least in my case, the media and entertainment vertical, where technology partners are trying to leverage AWS to help their customers. Here to talk a lot about media asset management architectures in the context of IMF. Some of you may or may not recognize this mountain. This is Long's Peak. And the reason I put it up there and put MAM on there, because many of you, especially studio execs, have gone through several generations of media asset management. And you should know that this mountain has the most deaths in Colorado of people trying to scale it. I think in Colorado, 370-ish people have died on 14ers within Colorado. And this one is responsible for 76 of them. So thought it was appropriate to start off with some of the things that we've done. So this is actually a famous trail climbing that mountain where you're going up to the keyhole. But essentially it describes the road here, right? Where we're always going to see the demand continue, and IMF is a critical part of that. And we've always thought of media asset management in the context of managing assets. Now we have to think in the context of managing components if we're going to support IMF. And for that, my specialty is in media asset management I say that I've done time, probably 20 years or so, doing digitization and asset management strategies. And in that time, I found that it's best to break up that complexity that's associated with that into a framework, which I'm going to talk about in the context of IMF. So, and then of course, how would you get started in this? So, the people in this room are all familiar with, the demand for, great content globally in the format that people want to consume it, and that is constantly changing. And I think the key figure here is now people are expected to create well over 200, if not more, versions of every piece of quality content that comes out. And of course, there is a large component of that is always the same, which is why we have the promise of IMF. And you'll note that I always have a progressive rock reference in the presentations that I do. And I thought IMF is really awesome from a spectrum of being able to break things down into components and get these, these bright color deliverables that come out of it. Taking something that used to take up so much storage in your archive and be able to componentize it and break it down to where it can literally service any endpoint. Bruce Devlin, which I know many of you know from SMPTE, and he's a big champion of IMF. He conservatively estimated a 50% savings in storage and a 60% reduction in data movement. If you go and you do your research on this, you know that Annie Chang and the BBC have actually come up with studies where they're estimating more along the lines of 90%. So I think Bruce is being very conservative in this space. So I think IMF is very relevant, it's very credible, it has legs, and so I want to talk about it in the context of media asset management, and I want to point out kind of, one of the industry problems where people will start confusing media asset management with digital asset management with CMS, and let's just kind of get this out on the table and breathe. Media asset management's not the same as a digital asset management system. There's a large focus on video, audio, and photos in a media asset management system. There are different vendors, different complexities, and all of that is kind of managed in your MAM. Also, if you come from post-production world, I want to point out what also is not a media asset management or a sustainable IMF strategy, which, are the human workflows, which are, have been indicative in this industry for 40, 50 years. Also, FileMaker and Excel are not real media asset management systems. I would also argue that digital hoarding and creating digital structures, digital structures and relying on file naming conventions for managing these types of structures is also not going to last. IMF has done away with, using the file name as a primary source of metadata. I would suggest we all do the same. And then, of course, if you're starting from a physical source within your IMF workflow, it's going to be pretty slow and it's going to have some issues. So, media asset management, it's great. In and of itself, when it's self-contained and it has very small use case to service, but candidly, most of your facilities don't have just one media asset management. They've got several, right? And they all have different management drivers. They're all using different schemas. Metadata atrophies over time. They're all working within, certain physical constraints. And this is kind of a problem of which I've listed one or two. Essentially, it is a finite resource when it's on site. You have lots of issues where different MAMs and different organizations are replicating services and doing the exact same work over and over again. You have metadata atrophy. You have, of course, you have to do the technical refresh and other issues which commonly occur. So to break this out, I actually have, I created this framework, and I think this framework is really important because media asset management is quite complex. And if you try to chew it as one thing, it's quite complex. So essentially, you focus on those 6 core areas that really make up being able to manage your media asset management. So ingest, metadata search, all the way down to storage management. Those are the critical pillars that if you focus on in isolation, you can break them down into meaningful components that'll make a foundation for your other services. And then, of course, there's a bunch of variability, as you all know. Where are you in the video ecosystem? Are you on the capture side, or are you on the production, distribution, or archive side? What is the use case that you're trying to service? Are you in the sports industry? Are you in the studio industry? Are you in television? All of these things matter and have a lot of context as far as the technology choices you make on this. And it's funny, I've always been working in media asset management, and as I've gotten into IMF, I found, well, these are the exact same core foundations that I need to think about with an IMF perspective. Only now I'm thinking down at the component-based level as far as managing all of these assets. So if I start thinking about that, and let's break it down. So if I go into ingest, right? Ingest, and from an AWS perspective, of course, I'm promoting a content lake architecture where you can centralize all your content into one location, get real control over it. But you need to consider, where are the source locations that I'm going to be getting content from? How do I create a relationship within those assets? And how can I leverage machine learning to start establishing a foundation of metadata against all of my assets so that I am less and less reliant on human intervention to provide that meaningful metadata? And as you can see, AWS, there's a bunch of tools as far as file transfer goes, and the machine learning is the piece that I think people really need to take a hard look at because it is making meaningful differences for people. From an innovation perspective, serverless and machine learning go together, and in the cloud, this is a very powerful expression. As part of my role within AWS, I helped launch a solution called Media to Cloud, which essentially was the concept that you could create a templated framework for ingest. And everyone who's been in this business for a while understands the ingest process where you're putting metadata and you're building out proxies and you're essentially getting assets under management, is what it's called. So if I could create a template that actually takes all of those processes, put them together in a secure installation profile for AWS, we've now made it a way that people can get assets up into AWS with standard formats and a standard baseline of machine learning metadata against all those assets. So you get improved search capabilities. And this is the architecture that's been developed, and we're going to be showing some new functionality at IBC here for this. We've just added a new partner on the MAM side that can then accept all of that content and metadata into their system, Nomad CMS. We also have a partner on the on-prem side that can help take care of the complexities of proprietary formats. So next core building block is metadata. I mean, you want to analyze your metadata and think about the end state goals and think about them in the context of, well, what is the metadata packaging that supports IMF? So, how do I build my CPL, my OPL, my packaging list, and make sure all of that is there? Make sure there is a relationship between a universal identifier and the file name so that you can make that asset list. Again, lots of tools available for this. You can also start to consider machine learning for this, and I would argue that we have a great use case that we can talk about with OSN. OSN is using our machine learning tools with the help of Gray Meta to be able to build out compliance data and transcription services to speed up that localization process. And if you think about that in the IMF context, that's going to help your localization partners break down and provide you services with a baseline of metadata. It's going to speed up their job in building out the components and the languaged assets that you need. So for metadata considerations, understand that there's multiple different types of metadata that's associated to an asset. It's not just technical, it's not just descriptive. You want to think about it from an automation perspective. You want to think about it from a reporting perspective, because if you're Disney, at the end of the day, they're likely going to want to know how much endgame costs to make through all of the versions and processes. And that's only going to happen if you're capturing that metadata up front. So I would suggest that as part of this process, and I've actually took this idea from Optimity Advisors, but essentially make your own 10 commandments for metadata. This was mine. Your commandments may vary, but it shows that you really thought about the process in advance, and that you're really thinking and making conscious efforts to meet the criteria of how you're going to build out a scalable IMF or component-based asset management platform. So the next core building block is user experience and media tools. And candidly, this is where I am evangelizing to all of our media asset management partners and supply chain partners. Is, AWS has already built this incredible foundation of services of authentication and database and serverless and all these functionalities. So you really want to focus on user experience and media tools, because that's what your customers are looking for. And you can do that through process mapping or user personas, working backwards efforts. And as you're going through those tools, just know that on top of AWS, they have a massive ecosystem of partners that you can reach into. And from an IMF perspective, we have several partners that are already working on the IMF components. And we also have a lot of professional services partners that can help engage with you to help you develop out your metadata model and help you figure out what your end state objectives should be. And one example of one of these partners is OwnZones. OwnZones has done an incredible job of taking metadata and component-based content and putting that together into a great user experience that's very familiar with people that have always worked in production. These tools look just like the nonlinear editing tools that they've seen in the past, so the training is very low. But they also, they built a great architecture behind the scenes. They've leveraged containers and they've leveraged serverless. In fact, this was a recent benchmark that they did, but essentially they're showing that they're able to take Kubernetes containers, fire off spot instances. Spot instances are EC2 services or servers that you can achieve on demand when they're available, and essentially fire off hundreds of them, or if not thousands, to process out your transcode. And they're seeing a benchmark of getting it done in under a minute for your IMF package processing. Now, that does not include the checksum, and we all know that serial checksum like MD5 and SHA-1, those have to process in their own time. But if we can figure out how to change those processes or just use faster processing units, we can also shorten that time. And by the way, we do have a solution coming out there where we've taken the serverless MD5 component out of media to cloud. We're adding SHA-1, and that will be available as a solution off of, I think it'll be off of GitHub soon. So stay tuned on that one. So if we look at workflow, again, you want to have your principles. Move the master as little as possible. You want to define the third party and remove access mechanisms. You want to be able to do, again, process mapping to figure out where in that workflow you can cut out the, where you're moving files from one location to another, or where human interaction is really not necessary in that process. So, one great example of this, and I love this, is Deluxe One. I love the concept of it from my own view, just because what they've done is they've taken this Medio ecosystem of, kind of a white glove service for their customers, but essentially they've taken metadata and content and they've wrapped it as services. Not only that, but they've wrapped competitors and they've wrapped creatives in their own home as services into the full ecosystem. So Deluxe One can wrap, when they do a localization project, it may include several competitors, but they show up as a service within the system, and they have found a way to make it to where they can expand their model to support much larger projects. And this is another beauty of the cloud. I've talked to several production companies, and when you're talking about IMF on-prem, oftentimes they're talking about, because of our limitations within the facility, we're generating hundreds of IMFs per month. And when I'm talking to companies that are in the cloud, because they are able to scale with spot instances and leverage elasticity and serverless, Those conversations are well into the thousands as far as what they're being able to process. Mikros is just an example that I'm going to give from another industry from a rendering perspective. This project was leveraging 170,000 simultaneous cores in the cloud, which is not something that could have been done on-prem. And I think it's important to note that. I also want to point out that Netflix, from a global media delivery perspective, they are all powered off of IMF on the receiving end. They're generating 60 different versions, globally distributing the content and making all of that work. So obviously, they're a phenomenal customer. And then, lastly, on the workflow side, I did want to mention quickly that this IBC, we will be doing a beta showing or demo of the Media Exchange solution, which essentially we have so many customers and partners that are trying to move content between each other that we wanted to provide a QuickStart solution that would allow them to move content between their organizations, leveraging the lowest cost in an immutable path to make that optimized, lower the cost, the efficiencies. And some customers know that if we stay within that infrastructure, they know they don't have to unpack and re-QC and do all those processes again. So we're trying to take advantage of that. Another core building block, Architecture API. So if anyone's worked with AWS, this is one of the, one of our critical frameworks that we've developed over time, and it's part of our experience. It started in 2012, where we found just pattern recognition of constant things that were the platforms that were not failing were always doing the right things in 5 different areas. And so we've developed this well-architected framework. Up until recently, it was always delivered by a solutions architect working with our customers and partners. But last year, we launched this as a tool within your AWS account so that you can self-audit and critique exactly how you're launching solutions in the cloud and making sure that you're taking advantage of all the benefits. Another thing that we do, and not just within media and entertainment, we do this all over in all of the industries, but specifically for M&E, we have worked with the ISE to develop out some additional security tools, to help studios and broadcasters. Specifically on the rendering front, with a security hardening guide, and the same for media asset management. So if you're working with our company in some place and you're interested in those security guides, please talk to your account manager or feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to show you how to get a hold of those. And then again, we're always trying to steer our customers over to a microservices strategy where they're leveraging services that are resilient. They're cost effective because of the structure that we've developed, and they just it gets people to focus on media specific items in the user experience. Lastly, the core building block storage management. AWS has multiple layers of storage tiering capabilities, and I'm sure all of you have heard of the recent launch of Deep Glacier last year, which now brings storage down to $1 a terabyte a month, roughly. Although, as this is a video, please check your prices. They're constantly going down. But I also want to point out that from a content lake architecture, it's really important that we're a strong believer in security. So these buckets, you should be focusing on using encryption at rest and in transit. We have our own tools. We have a lot of security partners that can provide the same, depending on what you would like to use. And so when you get to, all of this put together, you start thinking about, okay, so I have my MAM architecture in a content lake architecture. I have the different storage tiering available to me. It's all encrypted at rest and in transit. So when my acquisition group is coming in, and maybe it's multiple production companies that are sending content in, all of that can be secured and controlled within your content lake. You're controlling the borders, which is awesome, because now you can actually enforce a universal identifier, which I would challenge you to try and do on-prem. That would be very difficult because you have so many points of entry within that system that you can't really control. Because it's in a centralized area, you're also controlling what happens from a duplicate process. You have visibility to it. You can use machine learning to start to establish that baseline of metadata against all assets, which will over time address that metadata atrophy thing I was talking about, where on-prem you have an LTO archive. It may have 50 petabytes in it. It has a lot of versions you could never delete. I'm sure it has video in there that only has a file name and a barcode. You can never find it with your MAM. So if you actually think about it, you're likely going to see a large storage reduction off of that when you do this move into into a cloud architecture. So now, if you think about this from from an IMF perspective, now I can build an architecture where localization partners I can work with them to version out and build out my IMF and my distribution downstream, all from one central location, which is easy, which I can control. So, when you're thinking about all this, like I said at the beginning, IMF requires component level management, and to me, that's similar to asset management. I'm not talking a big monolithic silo media asset management, but you do need to think about how you're going to manage those components and create those relationships, and make sure that you have a source of truth. And my personal opinion is on-premise doesn't scale. You have finite systems, and you're also doing a lot of management that's outside the realm of your normal business model. And my framework, I would love to debate with anybody, because I strongly believe that framework is going to help us get the complex under control to where we can simplify and create better solutions. But I would encourage you to break down that complex into building blocks. And if you're going to use AWS, use our innovation services. Don't just move something up and create a hosted model. Take advantage of serverless. Take advantage of containers and Elastic. And EC2 Spot is 90% cheaper in a lot of cases than if you're using just on-demand services. So take a hard look at that stuff. It's important. And then, of course, machine learning is really critical, because I do think that over time, the only way that massive archives are going to survive is if you can find the assets you need when you need them. And of course, AWS has a large media entertainment vertical team. We're global. We're happy to help you with this process. So if you're looking for help, one way to start is we have these QuickStart Guides on our website. So if you want to turn up a live to VOD service, or if you want to turn up media to cloud, all of those are QuickStart Guides up on AWS, and you can use that service at any time. And of course, talk to us, and we'll be happy to work you through it. Here's a slide that just kind of shows the different QuickStart Guides that we have. We have Edit in the Cloud, which is set up with our partner Teradici. You also have a live streaming capability, live subtitling, translation, video on demand. Those are leveraging Amazon's media services. And then, of course, my favorite, Media to Cloud. And there's other metadata generation tools as well. So I appreciate all of your time. But thank you very much for your time.